Welcome to Tigray Television. I'm Erin Imana. We'll be reading the news for you today. Stay tuned. The government of Tigray issued a statement earlier today regarding the closure of Alula Banaga Airport in Mala. The government said despite false claims by the Ethiopian authorities that the government suspended airport operation, that the airport was in fact forced to close due to lack of fuel. The statement said that the government was attempting to find all possible means for the airport to restart operations and emphasized that the ban on the fuel was a major impediment for an effective humanitarian response in Tigray. The statement emphasized that the motivation of Addis Ababa authorities in falsely claiming that the operation were deliberately suspended was fundamentally political, not humanitarian, and was an indication of the fact that the Ethiopian government has continued to tighten its noose around the people of Tigray. Tigray External Affairs Office issued a briefing this week in which it said that despite international praise to Abiy Ahmed for improving access for delivery of humanitarian goods into Tigray, just 24% of much-needed assistance had reached Tigray so far. Equally concerning, the office said, is that just half of the assistance has been distributed as lack of fuel continued to cripple humanitarian response in the region. Abel Tsagabu has more.
The Tigray External Affairs Office issued a briefing this week where it said that despite the increasing publicity the Ethiopian government was receiving for improving access to aid, just 24% of much-needed assistance had reached Tigray since the declaration of the humanitarian truce. The office said that just half of that assistance has been distributed from warehouses as the Ethiopian government has continued to block fuel pertinent for the delivery of humanitarian assistance. The office said that the international community's untiring praising to the Ethiopian government for allowing aid into Tigray is falsely leading the Ethiopian government to believe that the delivery of humanitarian assistance is charity rather than a legal responsibility. The office said more needed to be done to respond to the crisis in Tigray, including facilitating the provision of fertilizers, seeds, agrochemical and other agricultural inputs, saying that raising the productivity of Tigrayan farmers will improve food security over the coming year. The office also said the restoration of vital public services such as banking and telecommunication would be essential to address the humanitarian crisis, including the effectiveness of humanitarian organizations working inside the regional state.
UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, has said that the Tigray's farmers are in serious danger of losing the planting season between June and August if they're not able to receive urgent assistance to sow their fields. FAO says that farmers would need access to agricultural inputs, particularly fertilizers and seeds, over the coming weeks. FAO said that it's seeking assistance up to $96 million to purchase these agricultural inputs, of which it has only been able to attain $11 million, just 10% of what's needed. The organization warned that the failure to meet the needs of farmers would further exacerbate the humanitarian catastrophe and would be even more expensive to address. In connection to this, FAO stressed that the first priority should be given to fertilizers, which is applied 3 to 4 weeks after planting. The report summarized that the next harvest will not be available before October 2023, extending the hunger season for a further year and increasing humanitarian foods needs unless these inputs are entered into Tigray as soon as possible. Yesterday marked the third anniversary of the assassination of the Chief of Staff of Ethiopian National Defense Forces, General Saara Mokonnin, and other retired General, Major General Gazai Aberra. On the same day, in another part of the country, Amhara regional state authorities, including the region's president, would be shot dead, taking Ethiopia back to the days when assassinations were a popular means of achieving political means. Saron Zagai has a report.
In the early evening hours of June 22, 2019, talk of an explosion in the capital of the Amhara region, Bahar Dar, would spread all over social media. Ethiopian politics for a decade before that moment had not been very eventful. While it appeared to have more ups and downs since the coming to power of Abiy Ahmed, it was still relatively stable. But that Saturday night, witnesses reported explosions coming from 3 buildings, the headquarters of the region's police commission, from the state legislation office, and the office of the president, Later, U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa would report gunfire in the capital. The Chief of Staff of Ethiopia's National Defense Forces, General Sa'ara Mokonnin, one of the most powerful men in Ethiopia, was shot dead by his bodyguard alongside a retired general, Major General Gazai Abarra, both ethnic Tigrayans. Hours later, it was revealed that the president of Amhara Regional State, President Ambacho Mokonnin, too, had been killed alongside his advisor, Izazwase. The region's attorney general would die days later. All were attending a meeting in the regional cabinet in Bahir Dar. Government narrative on what exactly unfolded that evening are highly discredited by the public. Till this day, no one has been held responsible for the deaths of these officials, but what has been clear since that evening in June is that assassinations had made a comeback in Ethiopian politics. Murder and violence were once again a legitimate means of achieving political ends.
The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed says there's been an attempted coup in the northern Amhara region of the country. 4 people are said to have been killed in the coup attempt, with the region's head of security, Asamnu Tsige, the alleged orchestrator. Those killed in Bahir Dar, the regional capital, seen here in relation to Addis Ababa, are said to include Ethiopia's Chief of Staff and 3 other senior officials, including Amhara State's President Abamchu Mokonnin.
Assassination is one of the oldest tools of power struggle and the expression of certain psychopathic disorder. Leaders all over the world use this method to stay in power. It's also one of the main things that distinctly characterized the last 2.5 years in Ethiopia. This tactic was an important tool in how Ethiopia's former ruling junta, the Derg, would ascend to and legitimize power. The Derg killed high-level officials from the imperious regime, including 2 former prime ministers, in one night killing spree. Later, Colonel Mengistu Hailemariam would use a series of assassinations to remove his comrades and to ascend to power, after which Sagazab Kasa, a military historian from Maqala University, tells us assassinations became the most apparent means through which political differences are resolved.
In Ethiopia has also its own experience in this regard. For example, the Derg regime came to power by purging the royal families and Haile Selassie and his families, and Haile Selassie was murdered by Haile Mariam directly. Of course, there was a revolutionary process that deposed the regime, but personally Haile Selassie was killed, and then that act of murder was an assassination by itself. But after the coming to power of the Derg, immediately in Ethiopia, assassination has become the norm. Mengistu Hailemariam just ascended to power. He just rose fast to power by assassinating his comrades, like Tafari Banti, Aman Amdum first. The first one was Aman Amdum, because he was the first chairman of the Derg, and he was assassinated. Then Tafari Banti, then Adnafu Abate. And finally, Mengistu came to power after assassinating these 3 prominent figures of the Derg.
The norm of using assassination as an instrument of politics ended with the coming to power of Ethiopia's People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. But with the removal of the former government and Abiy's mount to power brought back the act of using assassination as a means of conducting politics.
With the coming to power of Abiy after 1990, we see assassination coming back to Ethiopian politics again as a tool to stay in power. The first victim of this was Engineer Semenyo. His case was a clear act of assassination, and it was clear to all that it was done by Abiy's regime.
Just over a year after the assassination of General Sa'ara Mokonnin and Major General Gazai Abarra in 2019, a brutal war would be waged by the Ethiopian and Eritrean governments on Tigray. Sagazab tells us the death of the Chief of Staff in 2019 weakened Ethiopia's National Defense Forces and made the military vulnerable to manipulations and personal demands of the Prime Minister.
It signifies the start of a dictator. I mean, the coming back of a dictatorial regime in Ethiopia. Sa'ara did strong reform move, and he was just about to finalize a huge reform within the army and to make it more strong and more accommodative. In the testimonies of Abiy, and his colleagues, Saara was doing this job on the eve of his assassination. But when the chief of staff was doing this task of huge titanic task of reforming that institution, that big institution, that strong institution that was a force behind the stability and development, peace in Ethiopia and the region, then Abiy dispurged or committed an act of assassination.
A government led by a leader promising to heal a nation is now buried under piles of crimes. Assassinations, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, corruption, and crimes against humanity are now rampant more than ever before and taking the country to the edge of disintegration.
IDPs forced to leave their homes and their properties, their communities behind in search of shelter have been the most affected by the ongoing siege on Tigray that has blocked all forms of assistance from reaching the region. Our reporter Winta Kidana spoke with Gabramedhin Gabramikael, a diabetic patient displaced from western Tigray, where the Ethiopian government has been undertaking a relentless ethnic cleansing campaign, and he tells us living conditions have been beyond unbearable.
Gabramedhin Gabramikael is one of the many Tigrayans displaced from western Tigray. He was a resident of Humera until the start of the war on Tigray that has seen a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing from western Tigray. He says he was forced to leave his home when Eritrean forces started to shell the town of Humera on November 7th of 2020.
We left Humera on November 7 of 2020 because Eritrean forces were shelling our town. Many were injured, so we started running to save our lives. First we went to Zana, then Shara, and Abiy Adi. It was very difficult, but we finally reached Mekelle in December.
Gabramedhin has been sheltered in a health clinic repurposed to accommodate IDPs in Mekelle. But like many suffering from chronic illness, he has not been able to access medication due to the siege on Tigray that has left the medical stocks in Tigray depleted.
I have been diabetic for 10 years, but I used to get continuous medical treatment in Humera, and I used to take my prescribed medication properly. But once I get here, I was not able to get medication for more than 4 months. I first started to reduce my daily intake so that I could at least have some medication. But this exacerbated my condition. And later I was diagnosed with high blood pressure. I started to follow up at Eider, but they have no medication due to the siege. So I guess I'm just waiting my days now.
Lack of food aid and other essential supplies at the IDP camp, Gabramedhin says is exasperating his condition. For months, he says he hasn't been able to fulfill his dietary needs.
Back at home, I used to have access to healthy foods like teff and other sugar-free foods that my doctor advises me to consume. Here I cannot get food, let alone healthy food. Where I managed to find food, it is usually not within my dietary constraints, so it increases my sugar level.
Gabramedhin asks the world to give serious attention to the humanitarian situation in Tigray and ensure that basics like medication and food assistance are not used as a weapon of war.
Tigrayans are dying due to lack of food and medication. This is happening to us just because we were born Tigrayan. It's enough to be born human, to emphasize with our suffering.
The Ethiopian government has displaced over 1 million people from their homes in western Tigray. Equally devastating has been its blockade on food aid and medical supplies into Tigray, further devastating a community that it has forced to depend on humanitarian assistance for its very survival.
Fremnatos is a local charity organization based here in Mekelle that cares for the needs of the old and children. The local charity organization is also the only organization to provide education and treatment for children diagnosed with autism. But volunteers at the organizations tell us the center is no longer able to provide food or medical treatment to those it supports. Our reporter Aragawi Garamkel has more.
Saron Haile is just 16 years old. Saron has physical disability and was diagnosed with autism at a young age. Health professionals at the institution where she stays also tell us for which she needs medication. But health workers tell us the medical supplies needed her condition are unavailable. And even if they were available, the charity organization where she housed can no longer afford to buy it for her, as vital service to Tigray remained blocked.
Her name is Saron, and is around 15 or 16. Zamat, she has a good communication, and also there is a physical injury. Yeah, her right hand is paralyzed also, but totally generally Zamat, but there is she need other drugs. Zamat, there is also stress, so to relieve the stress or to make, yeah, she needs some medication.
Fremnatos, a local charity organization in Mekelle, is the only organization in Tigray that provides health care and education to persons diagnosed with autism. But for more than a year now, the organization has been denied access to banking, and a voluntary public health officer at the organization, Samuel Mahari, tells us that this has meant that many at the center are having to go without medical attention or food.
To the war, there is blockage of transportation, communication, internet, so finance, there is not also drugs, by the transportation, there is not enough food, so they need special care. So the first thing is that you need to develop, to respect their interests, so they maybe become angry or shout at you, so this is one of the problems.
Masarat is a resident of Fremnatos just like Saron. Masarat is 13 years old. She is visually impaired and has a physical disability that requires her to use a wheelchair, unavailable at the time owing to the blockade on medical supplies into Tigray.
She has also some physical problem, like she's blind. She cannot watch everything. She cannot see. She needs also some foods, and wheelchair.
Mahari Barihu, a chairman of the board member of the organization, says that the organization had found it difficult to meet the need of the people it's caring for, not to mention the thousands more across Tigray that are in need of housing and support in light of the ongoing war on Tigray.
ካብ ተፈላለየ ዞባታት ወረዳታት ትግራይ ናብ 300 ሕጋዊ ብማሕበራዊ ጉዳይ ዝመጸ ሕቶ ኣሎ።
We have accepted the application of 300 people that have applied to live in our institute, but I can even give you an estimate for the number of people that submit applications to come to our institute on a daily basis, especially from ID, children orphaned, and persons with mental and psychological problems that need continuous follow-up. These people are not only displaced away from home, but also have an illness that required continuous medical, but we can't help them. That's a terrible feeling.
The suspension of vital services such as banking, telecommunication, electricity has practically paralyzed institutions such as Fremnatos that could have played some part in alleviating the suffering of the millions in Tigray in their need of assistance.
The border town of Zalambesa has been one of the most highly affected by the ongoing conflict. Just at the outset of the war, Eritrean forces would indiscriminately shell this small town, killing many civilian residents and destroying property. Once soldiers entered the small town, they would kill and torture civilians, forcing many to leave their homes. Our reporters spoke with the residents that tell us of a massacre that unfolded in late November that forced many to leave their homes and has forever taken away their loved ones. Our reporter Haile Gabru has more.
The small town of Zalambesa, a town on the border with Eritrea, is one of the most devastated by the war on Tigray. Zalambesa was repeatedly bombarded by heavy artillery by Eritrean forces that would come to commit some of the most gruesome atrocities on residents. Till this day, Eritrean forces have continued their occupation of some part of Zalambesa, forcing residents to leave the area to settle in IDP camps in surrounding villages and towns. We met with some of the residents that tell us about the massacre that took place on November 23, 2020, just days after the occupation of the town by the Eritrean forces.
I had just given birth 2 weeks ago. My husband was caring for me and my children. He didn't know what to do, so he hid our children in a hole in the toilet and went outside when he heard commotion. When they called him, he told them he was a civilian and pulled out his ID and showed it to them. They killed him right there. I didn't know it at the time, but they had also killed my neighbor. It's hard to say how many they killed. They killed children, women, and pregnant mothers. We suffered a lot.
أنا بعال جزاي هاي لك حسايب بهاد بقفعين عاجنتا هرئنا وصع.
My husband's name was Haile Kahsai. They took him out. They said, "Where is the junta? Show us." They dragged him out of his home, away from his children, took him to a corner and executed him. But he wasn't the only one. They also killed Haben, Priest Sahle, Dawit, and Fraweni, and their grandmother who had come to visit. Abadit and my other neighbors, Tasfai Gabra Mariam and Huluf. In one instance, we had to bury 8 bodies in one grave. There were 6 people in the house, and 4 of us were injured. The fourth one was a child. He died. He was buried in the backyard of the house.
The families of the victims tell us they were not allowed to bury their family members for days. When they could finally bury the bodies, they tell us the bodies had turned rotten.
We buried them after 12 days. We didn't go back to the house after we left that day. How could we go back? We buried Priest Isaias in front of his 6 children, Gabra Kahsai and his wife, Tolda and his wife, in the yards of their home. Their bodies were rotten. We covered them with a towel and then buried them. They wouldn't allow us to bury them in a church.
I couldn't get out of the house as I had just given birth. I buried my husband in our yard and left the house.
Stories like that of the Zalambisa massacre are present throughout Tigray, where families and friends of loved ones, even over a year later, have not been able to properly mourn their loved ones or find solace and a promise that justice will one day be served.
We visited an IDP camp here in Mala and spoke to one mother, Nigasti. Nigasti, 24-year-old, left Humara at the outset of the conflict when Eritrean forces started to indiscriminately shell her hometown. Nigasti has been living in the IDP center here in Mala for more than a year now and just recently gave birth to her first child. Nigasti's son, sheltered in the IDP camp with her, is malnourished and has not received any vaccination since birth. Our reporter, Wintakidana, has the details.
Nigasti Radda is just one of the more than 1 million persons displaced from Western Tigray. Nigasti and her son, just 2 weeks old, are living in an IDP camp in Magala, where she tells us food aid and medical care is in short supply.
I gave birth at Kasich Clinic. Till this day, he hasn't received any vaccination. I can't breastfeed him because I'm not producing any milk. I'm hungry too. Look at him. He's so small. He doesn't get any food. I didn't get proper food when I was pregnant either. That's affecting him as well.
Nigasti started to call the IDP camp in Magala after she was displaced from Humara. She says she was employed and working at a restaurant when Eritrean forces suddenly started shelling the town. She says her and her father survived the attack and made their way to an IDP camp in Shira.
We didn't know where we were going. We were just trying to get away from them. We later reached Shira and then traveled to Abi Addi to join my mother. We came to Magala in March of 2021.
After making it to Magala, Nigasti had started to work as a house help. She says she was able to support her parents for some time, but that the siege had made it difficult for her to continue to do so. In time, things had become so difficult that she wasn't getting proper meals or medical follow-ups during her pregnancy.
I had to work house to house to support my father and myself. During my pregnancy, I couldn't get proper follow-up. There was no medication in the clinics. But the worst was the lack of food. My child was born underweight because I wasn't eating properly during that period.
Nigasti calls on the world to take action to help her and the more than 1 million like her who have been forced to leave their homes and are being denied access to humanitarian assistance.
There is no humanitarian aid here. The world has to help us get back home. We need help with most basic things.
That wraps up our news for the hour. I'm Maren from Tigray. Thank you for tuning in.